My daddy is hurting her again. The girl sobbed. The Hells Angels' next move froze all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. On a cold, quiet evening in a small suburban neighborhood, a girl's desperate sobs echoed through the streets. It was a sound that no one should ever have to hear, yet it was all too familiar to a pair of watchful eyes. A little girl, barely 8 years old, stood on the porch of a dilapidated house, trembling in the winter night. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows, but the darkness was only deepened by the silence that hung between each of her sobs. My daddy is hurting her again, she cried, her voice barely above a whisper, but the pain and fear in her words cut through the cold night air. Her small hands wiped at her tear-streaked face, and for a moment, she looked around, as if hoping someone would hear her cry for help. Inside the house, the faint sound of shouting could be heard, the unmistakable sound of a man's angry voice. He was yelling at her mother again. The girl's heart raced, knowing what would come next. The fear that gripped her every time her father's temper flared was overwhelming. But it was the helplessness, the feeling of being unable to stop the cycle of violence, that crushed her the most. She had tried calling for help before, but the neighbors ignored her. No one had ever come. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, she felt like someone might actually listen. Her sobs grew louder, but it wasn't just the sound of desperation anymore. It was the sound of hope. It was the sound of someone finally breaking through the walls of fear that had surrounded her for so long. As she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath, a loud roar cut through the silence. The sound of a motorcycle engine. A heavy rumble that seemed to shake the very air around her. The girl's gaze snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Out of the shadows, a motorcycle appeared, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beam of light in the midst of the storm. The rider, cloaked in black leather and patches, was like a figure from another world, one that didn't seem to belong in this small, quiet neighborhood. He was an imposing presence, but there was something about him that drew her in. He stopped in front of the house, his motorcycle idling as he looked at her with a steady, unreadable gaze. Without a word, he dismounted and walked toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. The girl hesitated, unsure if she should trust him, but the raw, primal instinct to protect herself and her mother urged her to take a chance. As he reached her, his eyes softened for a brief moment, and he knelt down to her level, his voice surprisingly calm and reassuring. "It's okay, kid. I'm not here to hurt you." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to melt away the tension in the air. She looked at him for a long moment, trying to decide if he was someone she could trust. Her father's voice still echoed from inside, but now it seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. "I'm going to help you," the biker said, his voice gentle but firm. "Now, tell me where your mom is." Without thinking, the girl reached out, grabbing his hand. She didn't know this man, but in that moment, he was the only one who had ever offered her anything other than fear. She led him to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The biker stood behind her, a protective presence she never thought she would have. As the door creaked open, she heard her father's voice once more, but this time, it was different. It was a voice filled with rage and disbelief as he saw the biker standing in the doorway. The tension in the air thickened, but the biker didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room. "You're not going to hurt anyone tonight," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. The girl watched, wide-eyed, as the biker's words took effect. Her father, for the first time in years, hesitated. He took a step back, his face twisted with confusion and fear. The biker stood tall, his eyes locked onto the man's. For the first time, the girl felt like she had a chance. The room was still tense, the echoes of the confrontation lingering in the air. The biker stood tall, his leather jacket glistening under the dim light from the porch. The father, still frozen in shock, looked between the girl and the biker, confusion and anger swirling in his eyes. The girl, clutching tightly to the biker's hand, stood silently behind him, her small face a mixture of fear and hope. The silence stretched on until the biker took a step forward, his boots heavy against the floorboards. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. The father hesitated, eyes narrowing as he tried to process the situation. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, his voice thick with frustration. The biker didn't flinch. He was used to this kind of confrontation, but this time, his focus was on the girl, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. "You're safe." The girl looked up at him, tears still brimming in her eyes. "But what if he comes back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The biker's heart ached as he heard the fear in her voice. "He won't. I'll make sure of it." With a nod, the girl finally seemed to relax, her shoulders no longer hunched in fear. She glanced over at her mother, who was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. The biker turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the damage. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now, the protective tone giving way to a more compassionate one. The woman hesitated before nodding, pulling her sleeve up to reveal bruises on her arms. The biker's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask how it happened. He could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the resignation. "We need to get you both somewhere safe," he said, his voice firm once more. "I can take you to a shelter, or if you need anything, just let me know." The woman's eyes flickered with gratitude, but there was something else too, shame. The biker could see it, and it made him feel an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He'd seen it before, in people who were too afraid to ask for help, too afraid to believe they deserved better. "Don't be ashamed," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're doing the right thing by staying safe. That's what matters." She nodded slowly, and for the first time in a long time, the weight of her situation seemed to lift, just a little. The biker stood up, glancing around the room one last time, his eyes scanning for anything that might indicate further danger. Satisfied that the immediate threat was over, he turned back to the girl and her mother. "You're not alone," he said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable certainty. "I'm here for you." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. "Thank you," she whispered. The biker gave her a small smile, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly. "You're welcome, kid." As the biker led the way out of the house, he glanced back one last time. He knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for tonight, at least, they were safe. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the quiet neighborhood, casting a warm light across the houses that lined the street. The biker, now known as Jake, stood at the window of the small room where the mother and daughter had settled for the night. It was a modest space, but it offered them a sense of safety that they hadn't had in so long. Jake glanced over at the mother, Sarah, who sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes tired but grateful. Her daughter, Emma, was curled up on the couch, her small form a picture of exhaustion but also peace. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, fearing that her father might show up to hurt them again. Jake turned away from the window and walked over to Sarah, his heavy boots muffled on the carpet. He had kept a silent watch over them throughout the night, not wanting to wake them, but the time had come to make sure they were ready to move on. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and calm. Sarah looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "About what?" she asked, her voice shaky, still not used to feeling safe. "About what happens next," Jake replied. "I've got a plan, but I need you both to be ready for it." Sarah nodded slowly, her hands twisting the fabric of her shirt as she looked down. She was afraid of what her life had become, afraid of what would happen if she stayed in this town. But mostly, she was afraid of how much she had allowed herself to accept the abuse. She had been trapped for too long, and now there was a chance to break free. Jake didn't wait for her to respond. He was used to getting things done, taking charge in situations where most people would freeze. "I've arranged for you both to go to a safe house," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's not far from here. I'll take you there myself. But we can't wait any longer. Your husband might not come back today, but he'll be back soon enough. We can't afford to wait." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him. She had heard the words safe house before, but she had never believed that she could actually get out of the life she had been living. She had been stuck in the cycle of fear for so long that the idea of escape felt foreign. "You'll be safe," Jake reassured her, his voice softer now. "I won't let anything happen to you. Not while I'm here." He turned to Emma, who was still curled up on the couch, her face peaceful in sleep. "We'll leave as soon as she wakes up," Jake added, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "This is your chance, Sarah. Don't let fear keep you here any longer." Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. She didn't know why she trusted Jake. She had barely known him for a day. But there was something about the way he stood, the way he spoke, that made her believe he would do whatever it took to protect them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Jake gave her a nod, not needing any further thanks. He had done what he had set out to do. He had intervened when no one else would. He had given them a chance. And now it was time to make sure they had a future. The next hour passed slowly, but eventually, Emma stirred. Her little eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Jake with a sleepy smile. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake smiled back at her. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to a place where you and your mom can be safe." Emma nodded, her expression serious despite her young age. She had seen enough in her short life to understand what safety meant. She wasn't just a child. She was someone who had learned to survive. Sarah stood up, wiping her face one last time. She wasn't the same woman she had been the day before. There was a sense of resolve in her now, a quiet strength she had been too afraid to acknowledge before. "Let's go," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm ready." Jake nodded, moving toward the door. "Stay close," he said to both of them. "No matter what happens, stay close." He opened the door, stepping out into the cold morning air. The neighborhood was still quiet, but there was a sense of urgency in the air now. Sarah and Emma followed him, walking quickly but cautiously. Jake scanned the street, making sure no one was watching, no one was waiting to ambush them. As they reached the edge of the street, Jake turned to Sarah. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice firm. "You're taking control of your life now. Don't let anything stop you." Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe she could start over. Maybe there was a life waiting for her and Emma after all. They made their way down the street, the morning light shining brightly as they moved toward a new future. The drive to the safe house was longer than Jake had anticipated, the streets unfamiliar and winding. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching for any signs that they were being followed, but the neighborhood had seemed quiet, and no one had been tailing them. Still, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He didn't trust anyone. Not anymore. As the car moved through the winding streets, Sarah sat in the front seat, her eyes fixed out the window, her mind racing. She couldn't believe she was doing this. For so long, she had felt trapped in her own life, caught in the web of her husband's abuse and the weight of 1,000 excuses for staying. But now, with Jake's help, she was finally breaking free. Beside her, Emma sat quietly, her small hands folded in her lap. She had asked Jake if they were really going to be safe, and Jake had assured her they would. Still, the fear lingered in her eyes. She was just a little girl, but the things she had seen in her short life had aged her far beyond her years. Jake caught a glimpse of Emma in the rearview mirror. She was so small, yet so strong. She had been through more than most adults ever would, and here she was, still holding on, still trying to trust. He admired her courage, but he also felt a deep, painful sadness for her. No child should ever have to go through what she had. The car finally pulled up to a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that blended in with the others, quiet and unremarkable. Jake parked the car in front of the house and turned off the engine. He was still scanning the area, his eyes moving over the surroundings, checking for any signs that they were being followed. "We're here," he said, his voice steady. Sarah took a deep breath and looked at Emma, who was staring out the window with wide eyes. "Are we really safe here?" she asked, her voice small but filled with a raw honesty. Sarah looked down at her daughter, her heart aching for her. She wanted to say yes, to tell Emma that everything was going to be okay, but the truth was, she didn't know. They had taken a risk by leaving, but it was a risk worth taking. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "We're safe now. We're going to be okay." Jake opened the door and stepped out, scanning the area once more before walking around to open the passenger side. He helped Sarah out of the car and then turned to Emma, his expression softened. "You're going to be just fine," he said, offering her a reassuring smile. Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to decide if she could trust him. After a long moment, She nodded and slowly stepped out of the car, her hand slipping into her mother's. The three of them walked up to the front door of the house, and Jake knocked gently. A moment later, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She looked at them for a moment before stepping aside to let them in. "You must be Jake's guests," she said warmly. Come in, come in. We've been expecting you." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as she stepped into the house. It was modest but welcoming, a small living room with cozy furniture and soft lighting. The woman led them through to the kitchen, where she gestured to a table already set with snacks and drinks. "Please, make yourselves at home," the woman said. "Jake told me everything. You're safe here." Sarah felt her shoulders relax for the first time in what felt like forever. It was a strange feeling, this sense of safety, but it was also a welcome one. They weren't running anymore. They had a place to rest, a place to breathe. The woman introduced herself as Mary and told them that she had been helping people like Sarah and Emma for years. She had seen the pain in their eyes, the same pain she had once known herself. "You'll be fine here," Mary assured them. "We've got a whole network of people who look out for each other. You're not alone." Sarah nodded, grateful for the kindness. She had never imagined that anyone would offer her this kind of help. She had always thought she had to do everything alone. But now, for the first time, she felt like there was hope. As she sat at the table with Emma, watching her daughter nibble on some fruit, she realized that she had a chance to rebuild. They both did. They had been through so much already, but this was their new beginning. Jake, standing at the door, watched them for a moment before turning to leave. He knew his job wasn't done. He had made sure they were safe, but there was still more to do. He had promised to protect them, and he wasn't going to break that promise. Before he left, he turned back to Sarah. "Stay here as long as you need to," he said. "No one will bother you here." Sarah nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Jake gave her a small nod and then walked out the door, closing it behind him. As he made his way to his motorcycle, he felt a sense of relief. They were safe now, but there was still work to be done. This was just the beginning of their journey, and he would make sure they had the chance to live a life free from fear. The days passed slowly in the safe house, but for Sarah and Emma, they felt like a breath of fresh air. The constant weight of fear that had plagued them for years seemed to ease, if only for a moment. Sarah, who had spent so long surviving, was learning how to live again. Every morning, she woke up to the sounds of birds chirping outside, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the warmth of a home that felt more like a real home with each passing day. Emma, on the other hand, was slowly coming out of her shell. The little girl who had once been afraid to speak her mind now smiled more often, her laughter echoing through the house as she played with some toys that Mary had brought for her. Jake had done his job well. He had gotten them to safety, but he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for them. There were still scars to heal, both physical and emotional. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in the living room, flipping through a book that Mary had lent her, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she opened it, she was relieved to see Mary standing there with a warm smile. "I brought you some supplies," Mary said, holding out a bag filled with fresh food and a few necessities. "I thought you could use a little restocking." Sarah smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Mary. I don't know what we would have done without you." Mary stepped inside, placing the bag on the counter. "It's nothing," she said with a shrug. "We look out for each other here." Sarah's eyes softened as she looked at the older woman. She had become a friend, someone Sarah never expected to find in a world that had felt so cold for so long. I never thought I'd get here," Sarah confessed, her voice faltering slightly. "I've spent so many years just trying to survive. I didn't know what it was like to actually feel safe." Mary placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know," she said gently, "but you're here now, and that's what matters." Just as they were talking, Emma ran into the room, a bright smile on her face. "Mom, look," she exclaimed, holding up a drawing she had made. It was a picture of a house with the sun shining brightly above it, a simple yet powerful image of hope. Sarah's heart swelled as she looked at her daughter's creation. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Emma's face lit up at the praise, and she hugged her mother tightly. "I'm glad we're safe now, Mom," she whispered. Sarah hugged her back, squeezing her tightly. "Me too, baby," she said softly. "Me too." Later that evening, after dinner, Jake returned to check in on them. He had been keeping his distance, giving them space to settle in, but he knew that they weren't out of the woods yet. There was still a lot to be done. As he walked into the living room, Sarah looked up and smiled at him. "Hey," she greeted him warmly. "How's everything going?" Jake took a seat across from her, his expression serious. "Everything's quiet for now, but we can't let our guard down," he said. "Your husband may be gone for now, but there's still the risk that he'll come looking for you. I'm going to need to get you both to a more secure location soon." Sarah's stomach churned at the thought of having to leave again, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had been running for so long, but she wasn't running anymore. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "I know you are," Jake replied, "but I need you to trust me. This next step is going to be harder, but it'll be worth it. We'll make sure you're safe." Sarah nodded, determination settling in her chest. "I trust you." Jake looked over at Emma, who was sitting on the floor, drawing in her sketchbook again. She looked so much like a normal child in that moment. The way she was so focused on her art, the way she laughed when her crayon broke and she had to grab a new one. It made Jake feel like he was doing the right thing. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," he said quietly. "You and Emma deserve a life without fear." The conversation shifted to logistics, discussing what needed to be done in the coming days. They spoke in hushed tones, strategizing about how to keep them safe without drawing attention. But underneath it all, there was a shared understanding. No matter how difficult the road ahead would be, they had each other. And with Jake's help, they could face whatever came next. The days blended together as Sarah and Emma prepared to leave the safe house and move to a more secure location. Sarah found herself thinking about what her life could be like once she was free of her past. She dreamed of a future where Emma could grow up without fear, where she wouldn't have to look over her shoulder every time a car drove by. It was a future she had never dared to imagine before, but now, with each passing day, it felt more and more within reach. The morning they left the safe house, Jake was already waiting for them outside, his motorcycle parked by the curb. Sarah took one last look at the house that had offered them refuge, a house that had given them a chance at a new life. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that, for the first time in a long time, she had hope. The morning light was still soft as Sarah and Emma sat in the back seat of Jake's motorcycle, their bags packed and ready. Jake led them through quiet streets, the engine of his Harley roaring under the silence of the neighborhood. They had left the safe house behind and were heading to the next step of their journey, a place that would offer them both safety and a fresh start. Sarah looked over at Emma, who was sitting quietly beside her, clutching her stuffed animal close to her chest. It was a small comfort in a world that had turned upside down. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She had been in survival mode for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to dream of a life without fear. But with Jake's help, things were starting to change. The ride was long, the wind whipping through their hair, but they didn't speak much during the trip. The weight of the past few days still hung heavy on Sarah's heart, but she was determined to leave it behind. The farther they went, the more she felt like she could breathe again. The town they were heading to was a small one, far from the city they had left behind. It was a quiet place where no one would ask questions, where no one would care about their past. The kind of place where they could blend in and start over. As they approached the town, Jake slowed down, pulling into a small gas station just outside the main street. He parked his bike and turned to Sarah. "We'll be safe here for now," he said, his voice calm but filled with the authority of someone who had done this many times before. "But you need to be prepared. It's not going to be easy. You're starting over, and it's going to take time." Sarah nodded, her eyes focused on the small town ahead. She was ready for this. She had to be. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her voice steady. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that there was no other choice. "I know you are," Jake replied, his eyes flickering with something like approval. He glanced at Emma, who had already gotten off the bike and was looking around curiously. "We'll find a place for you both, somewhere you can settle down and be safe. And I'll check in on you every now and then, make sure everything's okay." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had gotten them this far. He had been their protector when they had no one else. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jake gave a small nod and then swung his leg over the bike, ready to leave. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Take care of each other." Sarah watched as Jake rode off, disappearing into the distance. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. They were safe. They had a chance. Emma tugged at her sleeve, breaking her from her thoughts. "Mom, where are we going?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Sarah smiled down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love and pride. "We're going to start over, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're going to find a new home, a place where we can be happy and safe." Emma's eyes brightened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she smiled. "I like that," she said. Sarah took her hand, and together, they walked into the small town. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild. They found a modest house at the edge of town, tucked away from the main road. It was quiet, peaceful, and it felt like home. The landlord was kind, offering them the place at a reasonable rent, understanding that they were starting over. Over the next few days, they settled in. Sarah found a job at a local diner, working as a waitress, while Emma started attending the small local school. Life was simple, but it was safe. There were no threats lurking around the corner, no more fear of what might happen when they opened the door. Sarah felt like she was finally getting a chance to breathe again. One evening, after a long day at work, Sarah returned home to find Emma sitting on the couch, a book in her lap. She smiled as she walked in, seeing the comfort of their new routine. "How was school today?" she asked, sitting down next to Emma. "It was good," Emma said, her voice bright. "I made a new friend." Sarah's heart swelled. Emma was adjusting, thriving even, in ways Sarah hadn't expected. She had been worried about how Emma would handle everything, but her daughter was stronger than she had ever given her credit for. As Sarah sat there, watching Emma talk excitedly about her day, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but for the first time, Sarah felt like they had a chance at happiness. And that was all she had ever wanted for her daughter. In the quiet of their small home, Sarah allowed herself to smile, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Months passed, and the small-town life began to feel more like home with each day. Sarah had settled into her new job at the diner, working long hours, but with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and more importantly, it provided for her and Emma. Emma had made friends at school, and though the scars of the past still lingered, she was slowly starting to find joy in the simple things. She spent her afternoons playing in the yard, and Sarah often found her on the porch swing, smiling and chatting with her new friends. It was a peaceful existence, one Sarah had dreamed of for so long, but never truly believed was possible. Still, every once in a while, a shadow of fear would creep back into her mind. She would glance over her shoulder when she left the house, wondering if, just maybe, her past would come back to haunt her. But for the most part, those fears were fading into the background. Life had started to feel normal again, and Sarah cherished every moment of it. One evening, as Sarah was closing up the diner, she heard the familiar rumble of a motorcycle approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, a reflex she had developed after so many years of living with uncertainty. She turned around and saw Jake pull into the parking lot. She hadn't seen him in a while, but his presence was always a welcome sight. He parked his bike and took off his helmet, walking toward her with his usual calm demeanor. "Hey," he greeted her with a small smile. "How's everything going?" Sarah nodded, wiping her hands on a rag. "It's good," she said, though her voice held a hint of uncertainty. "It's been good." Jake studied her for a moment, his eyes sharp but kind. "You're doing well," he said. "I can tell." Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the door that led to the back of the diner. "I'm just still worried," she admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder." Jake's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "You don't have to worry about that anymore. You're safe now. You've got a new life here, and I'll make sure it stays that way." Sarah met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he meant it, but the lingering fear still held her tight. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully let go. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Jake nodded, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "It's my job to make sure you're safe," he said, his voice low. "But don't forget, you're the one who got yourself out. You've built a new life for you and Emma. That's not easy." Sarah smiled, but the smile was bittersweet. "I still don't know if I deserve this," she said softly, almost to herself. "You do," Jake said firmly. "You do, Sarah. You deserve peace. You deserve happiness. And I'll make sure you have it." Sarah's heart ached at his words. She had spent so many years in fear, believing she didn't deserve anything more than that. But Jake had shown her a different path. He had shown her that, with the right help, she could start over. She could have a life free from violence, a life where she didn't have to constantly worry. The doubt that had clung to her for so long was slowly being replaced by hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of normalcy. Sarah continued to work. Emma continued to grow and make new friends. And they both settled deeper into the rhythms of their new life. But despite the peace they had found, Sarah knew the world outside their small town still held dangers. One evening, as Sarah was walking home from work, she saw a car parked down the street. It was familiar, too familiar. Her heart froze in her chest as she realized it was the car her ex-husband used to drive. Panic surged through her as she quickened her pace. But before she could reach the safety of her house, she heard a voice call out behind her. Sarah. She stopped dead in her tracks. It was him, her ex-husband, standing just a few feet away, looking at her with an expression of anger and something darker in his eyes. What are you doing here? Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but filled with a quiet fury. I came to get my daughter, he said, his voice cold. You've kept her from me long enough. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Not now. Not when she thought she was finally free. She looked over her shoulder, expecting Jake to come charging to her side, but there was no sign of him. She was alone. You're not taking her anywhere, Sarah said, her voice firming as she stood her ground. She's not your property anymore. Her ex-husband stepped closer, his fists clenching at his sides. You think I'm going to let you take everything from me? He sneered. I'll make you regret this. Sarah's heart raced as he advanced, but just as she was about to turn and run, a motorcycle revved in the distance. It was Jake. He appeared at the end of the street, his bike roaring to life as he pulled up between Sarah and her ex-husband. He didn't even look at Sarah's ex. His gaze was locked on him, cold and dangerous. You're not going anywhere near her, Jake said, his voice low and lethal. Sarah's ex hesitated, clearly intimidated by the biker's presence. Stay out of this, he snarled. Jake didn't flinch. I'm not going to tell you again. Her ex took one last glance at Sarah and Emma's house before he turned and stormed off, his car screeching down the street. Sarah exhaled the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked up at Jake, who was still standing tall, his eyes never leaving the retreating car. You're safe now, he said quietly. No one's going to hurt you again. Sarah nodded, her heart still racing. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed him. The following weeks passed in a blur, but for Sarah and Emma, life was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. Emma had been thriving in her new school, making friends, and even talking about joining the local soccer team. Sarah was adjusting to her new job at the diner, and although the hours were long, it gave her a sense of purpose she had not known for years. They had come a long way since they first arrived in this small town, and while their journey wasn't over, they were finally starting to feel like they could breathe again. One evening, as Sarah was cleaning up after her shift, she saw Jake pull into the parking lot of the diner. She had grown used to his occasional visits, and though he kept his distance, he made sure to check on them regularly. She smiled as he walked in, his familiar leather jacket a comforting sight. Hey, he greeted her with a small nod. How's everything going? Sarah leaned against the counter, wiping her hands with a rag. It's good. Really good, actually. She paused for a moment, looking around the diner before meeting his eyes. I can't believe how much things have changed. Jake studied her for a moment, his eyes softening. You've done well, he said, his voice low. You and Emma both. Sarah glanced over at Emma, who was sitting at a table near the window, coloring in a notebook. The sight of her daughter, so peaceful and content, made her heart swell. It felt like a lifetime ago when she had lived in fear, constantly looking over her shoulder, never knowing what the next day would bring. Now, Emma had a future, a real one. Sarah smiled. We have you to thank for that. Jake shook his head, his usual stoic expression barely shifting. You did it, he said. You took the hardest step. I just helped get you here. There was a quiet sincerity in his words, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep gratitude toward the man who had saved them both. She had spent years telling herself she wasn't strong enough to leave, that it was easier to stay, but Jake had shown her that there was another way. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she had control over her own life. We're not there yet, Jake continued, his tone changing slightly, becoming more serious. Your ex might have backed off for now, but that doesn't mean he's given up. He'll keep looking for you. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She had known this day would come, but hearing Jake say it out loud made the reality hit harder. What should we do? She asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Jake's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening. We need to stay alert, he said. But you're not alone in this. If he comes around again, I'll be here. No one's going to hurt you again. Sarah nodded, taking comfort in his words, even if she wasn't sure how long they would be able to stay hidden. I'll be ready, she said quietly. Jake gave her a sharp nod before glancing over at Emma. She's doing well, huh? Sarah smiled, watching her daughter draw with concentration. She's happy. She's really happy, and that's all I want for her. Jake's expression softened for a moment, and he looked down at the floor. You're doing good, Sarah, he said quietly. Really good. After a moment of silence, Jake turned to leave, but before he stepped out the door, he paused and looked back at Sarah. I'll be around, he said, if you need anything. Sarah watched him walk away, the sound of his boots on the pavement echoing in the quiet night. She felt a sense of calm settle over her. No, the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The next morning, Sarah and Emma were walking to the local park, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the gentle breeze. Emma had insisted on wearing her new sneakers, the ones she had picked out herself. She was already becoming part of the small town, and it made Sarah's heart ache with pride. As they walked, Sarah's thoughts drifted to her ex-husband. She hadn't heard from him in weeks, but the fear of him reappearing still lingered. She had taken all the necessary precautions, changing their address, staying out of sight, and keeping a low profile, but she knew it wasn't enough. Her ex-husband was relentless. Just as they reached the park, Sarah's phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw the number she had hoped never to see again. Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to answer. Hello? She said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. Sarah. Her ex's voice came through, smooth and menacing. You think you can just disappear? You're not going to get away from me that easily. Sarah's blood ran cold as his words hit her like a punch. She gripped the phone tightly, her eyes scanning the park as if she could physically feel his presence. What do you want? She demanded, her voice now firm with the same strength she had found in herself since leaving him. I want my daughter, he replied, his tone dark. You'll regret this. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. Her stomach churned, but she refused to let fear take over. She had been through too much to back down now. As she looked at Emma, who was playing on the swings, laughing, she knew one thing for sure. She would do whatever it took to protect her. The moment of fear passed, replaced by the quiet resolve of a mother who would not let anyone, not even her past, take away the life they had built. The days after the phone call were filled with tension, but Sarah kept her composure. Her ex-husband's words echoed in her mind, but she refused to let fear control her. She knew the risks. She knew he wouldn't stop, but she wasn't going to let him take Emma from her. Sarah stayed vigilant, constantly checking the windows of their small house, listening for any sign of him. She even started taking different routes to work, making sure she wasn't being followed. Emma noticed the change in her mother's behavior, but didn't ask any questions. Sarah didn't want to worry her daughter, but she couldn't hide her growing anxiety. The park had been their safe place, the one spot where they could pretend everything was normal, but now even that seemed tainted by the shadow of the past. One afternoon, as Sarah walked home from the diner, she felt the familiar unease creep up her spine. She was halfway down the block when she saw the same car from before parked a few houses down. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly turned the corner, her breath coming in short gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her thoughts scrambling. Was he here? Had he found them? She walked faster, her eyes darting around, but she didn't see anyone. She got to the door, fumbled with the keys, and slipped inside, locking it behind her. Emma was in the kitchen, drawing again. Sarah quickly closed all the blinds, double-checked the locks, and took a deep breath. Mom, are you okay? Emma's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. Sarah turned to her daughter, forcing a smile. Yes, sweetheart. Everything's fine, she said, but her voice betrayed her. Emma looked at her mother with concern. You look scared, she said quietly. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's level, brushing a lock of hair from her face. I'm just being careful, sweetie. Nothing's going to happen to us. I promise. Emma didn't seem convinced, but she nodded and went back to her drawing. Sarah stepped into the living room, pacing for a moment as she tried to collect herself. The fear was suffocating, but she couldn't let it show. Not now. Not when Emma needed her the most. The phone call from her ex-husband kept replaying in her mind, and Sarah knew that they couldn't stay in this town forever. It was only a matter of time before he found them again. She needed to do something, but she didn't know what. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but before she could think further, there was a knock at the door. Sarah froze. Her first thought was that it was him. She didn't even hesitate before grabbing the nearby baseball bat, her grip tightening around it. She tiptoed toward the door, peeking through the peephole. It was Jake. She sighed in relief and opened the door. Hey. He greeted her with a small, reassuring smile. Can I come in? Sarah stepped aside, letting him in. What's going on? She asked, her voice still tight from the earlier tension. Jake's expression shifted slightly. I came to check on you. I know things have been rough, but I need you to know you're not alone in this. If you need anything, I'm here. Sarah nodded, the knot in her chest loosening just a bit. Thanks, she whispered. I'm just scared. Jake's eyes softened. I get it. You've been through a lot, but you have to trust me when I say he won't get to you. Not while I'm around. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him. She wanted to believe him. She really did. But a part of her was still terrified that her past would catch up with them. I don't know how much longer we can stay here, Sarah said quietly. I've been thinking about what you said, about moving on. I just don't want to put Emma in danger. Jake nodded, his expression serious. I understand. But for now, we take it one step at a time. Let's get you out of here safely first. Then we can figure out what's next. Sarah looked at Jake, seeing the determination in his eyes. She trusted him. She had to. He had already proven himself to be her protector, and for the first time, she felt like there was someone who could stand up to her past. I'll do whatever it takes to keep Emma safe, Sarah said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. Jake smiled. That's all I need to hear. He paused for a moment before speaking again. I've been in touch with a few people. We've got options. You don't have to do this alone. Sarah felt a small surge of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They had a plan, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had a future. I appreciate it, Sarah said softly. I really do. As Jake left, he turned back to her. We'll get through this, he said. Sarah watched him go, her heart still heavy but filled with a quiet sense of determination. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. She would keep fighting for her daughter. She had to. The next few days were filled with quiet tension. Sarah and Emma continued their routine, trying to find comfort in the normalcy they were beginning to build. But Sarah's thoughts were never far from the phone call she had received from her ex-husband. It had been a week since he had threatened her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still waiting for the right moment to strike. She knew he wouldn't just let them go, but she also knew she couldn't keep hiding forever. Jake had offered help, but Sarah didn't want to drag Emma into another situation where they were constantly running. She wanted to fight back, to put an end to this fear once and for all. One evening, as the sun set and the last customers left the diner, Sarah was cleaning up when she felt a presence behind her. She turned, startled, to see Jake standing in the doorway. Hey, he said quietly, his tone calm but serious. I've been thinking. It's time to make a move. Sarah frowned, setting down the rag she had been using. What do you mean? She asked, her heart suddenly racing. Jake stepped inside, his boots clicking softly on the tile. I've got a plan, he said. It's time we take control, Sarah. We're not going to keep running. We're going to fight back. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean, fight back? She asked, the words barely coming out as she tried to process what he was saying. Jake's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Sarah saw something else in his expression. Determination, a quiet intensity. We're going to make sure your ex doesn't have the chance to hurt you or Emma again, he said firmly. I've got contacts, people who know how to handle situations like this. We're going to take the fight to him, and we're going to do it on our terms. Sarah swallowed, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but a part of her, the part that had been running for so long, wanted to believe that they could finally take control of their future. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering of fear in her chest. Jake stepped closer, his voice lowering. I need you to trust me, Sarah. We're going to gather all the evidence we can. We're going to make sure he knows that this time, you're not going to back down. Sarah hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But as she looked at Jake, she saw the same strength in him that had kept her going all this time. I trust you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let's do it. Over the next few days, Jake took charge. He arranged meetings with people who could help, including local law enforcement and a few trusted allies who could provide the support they needed. Sarah, though nervous, worked with Jake to gather any evidence they could. Photos, records, anything that could help build their case against her ex-husband. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something Sarah had ever imagined doing. But as she watched Jake take action, she felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't known before. For the first time in years, she felt like she was taking control of her life. The plan was set into motion, and soon, Sarah found herself standing with Jake, surrounded by people who were ready to stand up for her and Emma. It was a group of men and women who had been through their own struggles and understood what it meant to fight for a better future. They weren't going to let Sarah or Emma be victims anymore. As they prepared for the final confrontation, Sarah couldn't help but think back to the first time she had met Jake, the way he had shown up out of nowhere to protect them, to give them hope. Now, as she stood with him, she realized that this wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking back her life, her daughter's life. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Sarah stood at the edge of the parking lot, waiting for Jake's signal. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her hands shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. Emma was with Mary, playing at her house, safe for now. Sarah's stomach churned as she thought of what was at stake. This was the moment that would decide their future. Jake approached her, his eyes cold and focused. It's time, he said, his voice low but firm. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. She followed him to his motorcycle, and they rode to the location where they would confront her ex-husband. The plan was simple. They would show him they were no longer afraid, that he could no longer control their lives. When they arrived, they found her ex waiting in his car, as expected. He looked surprised to see Jake, but there was an air of defiance about him. What do you want? He sneered, his eyes narrowing as he saw Sarah and Jake approach. Jake stepped forward, his posture unyielding. This ends today, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. You've been hurting her for too long, and it stops now. Sarah stood behind Jake, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes fixed on her ex-husband. He looked at her for a moment, his face contorting with rage. But as he saw the determination in her eyes, his expression faltered. You think you can stop me? He growled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. You don't own her anymore, Jake said, his voice unshaken. This is your final warning. Her ex hesitated for a moment longer before muttering something under his breath and driving off. Sarah stood there, her breath coming in short bursts, as she realized that it was finally over. Jake turned to her, giving her a small nod. You're free, he said, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed him. The days after the confrontation were filled with a strange sense of relief, but the reality of Sarah's situation hadn't fully set in yet. She and Emma were safe now, or at least as safe as they could be, but there was still a lingering uncertainty. Sarah kept her guard up, still wary of what could come next. It had taken so long to get to this point, and now, the future felt more uncertain than ever. But one thing was clear. The strength she had found in herself had become something unshakable. As the weeks passed, Sarah and Emma started to settle even more into their new lives. Emma was excelling at school, making more friends, and even starting to show an interest in sports. She had a sparkle in her eyes that Sarah hadn't seen in a long time, and for that, Sarah was grateful. Her job at the diner had become more than just a way to pay the bills. It had become a source of pride. She was independent now, and she knew that she could handle whatever came her way. Even with the peace that had settled over them, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the past weighing on her. She had made a new life, but there were still days when the memory of her ex-husband's abuse would creep in, when she would catch herself looking over her shoulder or wondering if he was lurking somewhere close. It wasn't that she was afraid. She wasn't afraid anymore, but she knew the damage he had done, and that kind of fear didn't just disappear overnight. One afternoon, as Sarah was walking home from the diner, she ran into Jake again. He had been checking in on her every couple of days, making sure everything was still safe. Today, his expression was more serious than usual, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the concern in his eyes. "Hey, how are you?" Jake asked, his voice still steady, but with an edge of something else. "We're good," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Emma's doing great. She's really starting to adjust." "That's good," Jake said, but he didn't seem convinced. He looked at her closely, his eyes scanning her face as if he could see through the calm exterior she was trying to maintain. "But you're not okay, are you?" Sarah felt her chest tighten at his words. She wanted to deny it, to tell him that everything was fine, but she knew that he could see through her. She sighed, looking down at the ground for a moment. I don't know," she said quietly. "Some days are better than others, but I keep thinking about the past. It's like it never really goes away." Jake nodded, understanding more than she could have expected. "It won't go away overnight," he said gently. "But you're not alone in this, Sarah. You've got people who care about you. You've got me." The words hit her harder than she anticipated. She had known Jake as the man who had helped her, the one who had been there when she needed it most, but hearing him say that, hearing him offer that kind of support, was something else entirely. It wasn't just protection anymore. It was something deeper. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He gave her a small smile, one that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me. I told you before. I'm here for you, for both of you." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. She had spent so long believing that she was alone, that no one would ever truly care, but Jake had proven her wrong. He had been there when no one else was. He had stood by her, and he had given her the courage to move forward. And now, as she stood there, looking into his eyes, she realized that she had something to hold on to. Someone who cared, someone who understood. "I'll keep an eye on things," Jake continued, his tone soft but serious. "I won't let him hurt you again. I promise." Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she pushed it down. There was still so much to do, still so much uncertainty. She had come so far, but there was still a part of her that wasn't ready to fully trust. She had built walls around herself for so long that it was hard to let them down. But with Jake, she felt like maybe it was time. "I believe you," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to move forward. I have to be." Jake nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "You've already come so far." Sarah smiled faintly, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Maybe," she said, her voice soft. "But I couldn't have done it without you." Jake gave her a small, reassuring smile before turning to leave. "Take care of yourselves," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet urgency. "I'll check in again soon." As he walked away, Sarah watched him for a moment, feeling a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she hadn't quite been able to define. She turned back to the house, where Emma was waiting, a smile on her face as she played outside. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was finally on the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was no longer alone. She had made it this far, and with the people who cared about her, she knew she could go even further. The weeks that followed felt like a long, slow march towards something Sarah couldn't fully define. The sense of normalcy that had begun to creep into their lives after the confrontation with her ex-husband was now mixed with a new layer of anxiety. Sarah had always known that there would be bumps in the road, but now, the tension of the past few days felt like it was waiting to snap. Her ex-husband hadn't made any direct moves since that day, but the fear of him showing up again, of him somehow finding a way back into their lives, weighed on Sarah's mind constantly. The small town had become their refuge, but the nagging uncertainty still lingered. At the diner, Sarah kept her head down and focused on her work, but there were moments, brief flashes of unease, when she thought she saw someone watching her from across the street. Every car that drove by felt like a potential threat, and every time the door opened, her heart skipped a beat. It was exhausting, but she had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Emma, on the other hand, was thriving. She had made real friends at school, something Sarah hadn't allowed herself to dream of for a long time. She was more animated now, more alive. Sarah watched her daughter laugh with her new friends as they played outside, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the heavy burden of worry lift, if only for a moment. But the relief never lasted long. Sarah had become a master at pretending things were fine, but inside, she was constantly on edge. She hadn't told Emma about the threat from her ex-husband. She knew it would be too much for her to bear, and Sarah didn't want to take away the newfound joy Emma had found in her new life. But as the days passed, Sarah knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in fear, and she couldn't keep hiding. One afternoon, Jake showed up at the diner unexpectedly, as he often did to check in on them. He had been a constant presence in their lives, and Sarah was beginning to feel like they weren't so alone anymore. His visits had become a comfort, a reminder that there were still people who cared. "How are you holding up?" Jake asked, his eyes scanning her face, searching for any sign that she was hiding something. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Everything's good. Emma's doing great, and I'm starting to feel like we're really settling in." Jake studied her for a moment, clearly not convinced. "You know, you don't have to do this alone. If you need anything," Sarah cut him off, shaking her head. "I appreciate everything you've done for us," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I need to handle this on my own. I've come this far, and I'm not going to let fear control me anymore." Jake's gaze softened, and he gave her a small nod. "I get it," he said quietly. "But if you ever need help, you know where to find me." Sarah smiled at him, grateful for his understanding. "I know. Thank you, Jake." After he left, Sarah stood in the diner for a moment, lost in thought. She had made up her mind. It was time to take control of her life, to stop running. She couldn't keep waiting for her ex-husband to make a move. She needed to show him that she wasn't afraid, that she wasn't going to let him dictate her future. That night, as she tucked Emma into bed, Sarah leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emma's face. Emma opened her eyes and smiled sleepily. "Good night, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, baby," Sarah replied, her heart swelling with love. As she stood up to leave the room, she stopped for a moment, staring at her daughter. Emma had no idea of the danger that still lingered, no idea of the sacrifices Sarah had made to get them this far. But Sarah was determined to keep Emma safe, no matter what. The next day, Sarah took a deep breath as she prepared to leave for work. She had made the decision to confront her fears head-on. It was time to talk to the authorities, to make sure that her ex-husband couldn't come back into their lives. She couldn't wait for him to make the first move. She was going to take action. As she walked into the police station, the familiar feeling of dread crept in, but she pushed it aside. She knew this was the right thing to do. She had to protect her daughter, and that meant taking every step necessary. She walked up to the front desk and introduced herself to the officer on duty, explaining the situation and what had happened with her ex-husband. The officer listened intently, his expression serious as he took notes. "We'll take care of it, ma'am," he assured her. "We'll put a watch on him, and we'll make sure he doesn't get close to you or your daughter again." Sarah felt a small sense of relief. She had taken the first step. As she left the station, she realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. She wasn't going to let her past define her or her daughter's future. She had fought to get this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. That evening, after work, she returned home to find Emma playing with her new friends in the yard. The sight of her daughter laughing, carefree and happy, filled Sarah with a sense of purpose. She had come this far for Emma, and she would keep going, no matter what it took. As Sarah stood there watching Emma, she knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had the strength to face whatever came next, and for the first time in a long time, she truly believed that they were going to be okay. Months went by, and the small town continued to feel like a safe haven, the threat from Sarah's past slowly fading into the background. She had kept her promise to herself, and with Jake's help, they had ensured that her ex-husband couldn't reach them again. It had been a long, hard road, but Sarah could finally say, without hesitation, that they were free. Free from the fear, the uncertainty, and the constant vigilance. Sarah and Emma had made a new life for themselves, a life they could be proud of. Sarah had found herself truly settling in, not just physically, but emotionally. The walls she had built around herself over the years were slowly coming down. The woman who had once felt trapped, who had once lived in constant fear, was now standing tall, confident, and ready to take on whatever came next. Her job at the diner had become a steady routine, and while it wasn't glamorous, it gave her a sense of independence and accomplishment. Emma, who had blossomed in the safety of her new life, was thriving. She had joined the local soccer team, a sport she loved, and she had friends she could count on. Sarah watched her daughter play outside with her friends, laughing as she kicked the ball toward the goal, and for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to truly enjoy the moment. It wasn't just that they had escaped the past, it was that they had found something better. They had found hope. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, she heard the familiar rumble of a motorcycle engine. Jake was pulling into the driveway, his bike kicking up a small cloud of dust as he came to a stop. Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips. Over the months, he had become a constant in their lives, a friend, and a protector. He had given them more than just safety. He had given them something to believe in again. Jake dismounted his bike and walked toward the door, knocking lightly before stepping inside. "Hey," he greeted, his usual calm demeanor in place. "How's everything going?" "Good," Sarah replied, smiling as she wiped her hands on a towel. "Everything's great. Emma's outside, playing with the neighbors. She's really coming into her own." Jake nodded, glancing out the window where he could see Emma laughing and running across the yard. "That's good to hear," he said, his voice softening as he watched her. "She's strong, just like her mom." Sarah felt her heart swell at his words. "She is," she said, her voice filled with pride. "She's been through so much, but she's so much stronger than I ever thought possible." Jake turned back to her, his eyes locking with hers. "And you've been through just as much, Sarah? You've made it through the worst. You're both fighters." Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she met his gaze. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning whether she could be strong enough to protect her daughter, to build a new life for them both. But Jake had been right. She had done it. She had fought back when it seemed impossible, and now, standing in front of her, was the woman she had always hoped to become. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know where we'd be without you." Jake smiled, though it was small, almost like he didn't need to hear the thanks. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice steady. "I'm just glad you're both safe. That's all that matters." Sarah looked at him, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had come so far from the woman she had been. The fear, the uncertainty, they were still there sometimes, but they didn't define her anymore. She had a future, and so did Emma. The next few weeks brought more change. Sarah and Emma were officially starting fresh. With the protection and support Jake had given them, they were no longer running. Sarah signed up for a local community college, determined to make a better life for herself and Emma. She had a dream now, one she had put aside for so many years, and it was time to pursue it. Emma was just as determined. Her passion for soccer grew, and Sarah could see the fire in her eyes every time she played. They were both building something new, something that wasn't defined by their past. The past was behind them, and now, the future was something they could control. One night, as Sarah and Emma sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The world seemed still, quiet, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she could finally breathe. Emma leaned against her, looking up at the sky. "You know, Mom," she said softly, "I think this is our home now. I think we're really safe here." Sarah wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling her close. "I think so too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "This is our home." For the first time in a long time, Sarah could look toward the future without fear. She and Emma had made it through the darkest times. They had survived, and now they were thriving. Together, they were stronger than anything that had tried to break them. And as they sat there, under the setting sun, Sarah knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. They were ready. In this gripping Hell Angels story, a mother and her daughter struggle to escape an abusive past, finding hope and strength in the most unexpected places. As they seek refuge in a small town, they encounter a relentless ex-husband and face numerous challenges, but the resilience of a mother's love and the protection of a trusted ally lead them toward a brighter future. Through the eyes of Sarah and her daughter, we see the power of survival, the will to fight back, and the courage to start anew. These Hell Angels stories not only reveal the darkness that surrounds them, but also the light that emerges when they choose to stand up for themselves. Alongside unexpected allies, Sarah learns that there is always hope, even in the face of danger. As the story unfolds, the impact of past trauma becomes evident, but so does the strength it takes to overcome it. These Hell Angel stories show how the characters grow, develop, and rise above their fears, embracing a future that once seemed impossible. Each twist and turn in their journey uncovers new challenges, but their determination and bond prove stronger with each test. By the end, the power of these Hell Angel stories is not just in the action, but in the profound emotional journey that leads to healing and hope for a better tomorrow.